Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the anatomical features of disarticulated vertebrae. I want to first start by talking about structures that are common to almost all vertebrae. And so we're going to use this thoracic vertebra here as our example. Okay. So vertebrae possess a structure called the spinous process, and this protrudes posteriorly. This is a palpable structure. When you look at someone's back and you see that bony ridge going along the center of their back, those are the spinous processes. Transverse processes protrude laterally. Superior articular processes, and a body, which is the large bony structure in the vertebra. And there's a large hole called the vertebral foramen. In most vertebrae, the spinal cord is found in the vertebral foramen, but in the lower lumbar vertebrae, we find nerve bundles. Let's look at this from a lateral view. So again, spinous process, transverse process, transverse process, superior articular facet. Here we can see a new structure called, over here you can see a new structure called the inferior articular facet. This is the body, looking at it from an inferior view. Spinous process, inferior articular processes, transverse processes, vertebral foramen, and body. So we're going to see most of those structures on all vertebrae. So now let's take a look at specific vertebrae. So first of all, we have 5 vertebrae here. 3 of them are cervical vertebrae, 1 is thoracic, and 1 is lumbar. So let's start with our cervical vertebrae, which are our most superior vertebrae. This is the first cervical vertebra, also known as the atlas. This is the second cervical vertebra, also known as the axis, and this represents a typical cervical vertebra, which would be cervical vertebrae 3 through 7. Let's start by talking about the atlas itself. So this is the most superior vertebra in your body, and it will articulate with the skull. So these structures here are the superior articular processes that will articulate with the occipital condyles of the skull. So the occipital condyles of the skull will sit right in there. These are the transverse processes, and a unique feature to cervical vertebra are the transverse foramina. So these are holes in the transverse processes, and you can see those in all of the cervical vertebrae. Okay? They're not found in thoracic or lumbar vertebrae. So transverse foramina are unique to cervical vertebrae. It's a good way to distinguish a cervical vertebra. Coming back to the atlas, notice that the spinous process is not very developed. Okay? And there is no body. The atlas did have a body during development, but it fell off and it becomes the dens on the axis. Let's turn it over so we can see the inferior articular processes, and these will articulate with the superior articular processes on the axis. So let's take a look at the axis now. So we have a spinous process, transverse processes, and of course the holes in the transverse processes are the transverse foramina, transverse foramen for singular, foramina for plural. Superior articular processes, and the dens, which is sitting on top of the body. Let's look at it from the inferior view. Probably won't stay up because of that dens. Okay? You have the spinous process. Notice how the spinous process has a little bifurcation here. Looks kind of like a letter Y. This is called a bifid spinous process, and it can be commonly found on cervical vertebrae, though it does not have to be found on cervical vertebrae. Here's our body, transverse process with transverse foramina, vertebral foramen, and then these are the inferior articular processes. So these would articulate with the third cervical vertebra. So let's hop on over to our typical cervical vertebra. Again, spinous process, transverse processes, transverse foramen, or foramina for plural, vertebral foramen, body, superior articular processes, and if we flip it over, you can see all the same structures except for the superior articular processes cannot be seen. Instead, we see our inferior articular processes. All right, now let's take a look at a thoracic vertebra. So this is our thoracic vertebra here in the superior view. Right? And we have our spinous process, transverse processes, superior articular processes, body, vertebral foramen. Turning it over, looking at the inferior view, spinous process, transverse processes, inferior articular processes, body, and vertebral foramen. Now let's talk about the unique features on the thoracic vertebra. First of all, if we look at it from the lateral view, we can see a lot of these unique features. Notice the inferior pointing of the spinous process. Compare that to the lateral view of a typical cervical vertebra. Notice that the spinous process just points posteriorly. This spinous process is pointing inferiorly. Looking at the lumbar vertebra in the lateral view, the spinous process here also points posterior. So this is a really good indication that you're looking at a thoracic vertebra. Another unique feature to the thoracic vertebra are the presence of costal facets. So each rib will touch a thoracic vertebra at 3 points. There are 3 costal facets on each side of a thoracic vertebra, meaning each thoracic vertebra has 6 touch points with the rib. So the costal facets you can see here, here, and then here, right? So we have a costal facet on the inferior portion of the body and the superior portion of the body, and then another costal facet on the transverse process. So that's 3 on that side, and then you have 1, 2, 3 more over here. Right? So that's a unique feature to a thoracic vertebra. Last, we can look at the lumbar vertebra. Right? The lumbar vertebra is obviously very large, but sometimes that isn't a good indication that you're looking at a lumbar vertebra. And that's because the lowest thoracic vertebra, T12, is rather big, and it looks very similar to lumbar vertebra 1. So you really should look for other features if you're trying to distinguish between a thoracic and a lumbar vertebra. So now let's take a look at the anatomical features to a lumbar vertebra. So you have the spinous process, transverse processes, body, vertebral foramen, superior articular processes. Now these are rather unique. If you look at the superior articular processes on the thoracic vertebra, they face posteriorly. But the superior articular processes on a lumbar vertebra, they're kind of cup-shaped and they face one another. And again, here's that lateral view of the lumbar vertebra, noticing that posterior pointing spinous process. A lot of people say it kind of looks like a moose. Right? There's the nose of the moose. And I don't know what this is supposed to be. Some long fur hanging down, and it's got some antlers. Looking at the inferior view of the lumbar vertebra, body, transverse processes. Here are the inferior articular processes, vertebral foramen, and the spinous process. Right? Don't forget that we have 5 lumbar vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 7 cervical vertebrae. And a good way to remember that is that you eat breakfast at 7 a.m., you eat lunch at 12 noon, and you eat dinner at 5.